Welcome to this eighth episode of our online seminar series called Revisiting 10 Key TANTlab Papers. Today's topic is called Pluriversal Stories, which I guess for beginners could be described as an anthropological practice or genre of narrating a world that is not one world, but we'll know a lot more by the end of this session. I'm very pleased to see you. Please know that we will be recording these sessions and that you can find them later on the YouTube channel of TANTlab. You can also you can follow these episodes as single episodes, but you could also follow the entire series, and because there are reoccurring themes that will come up and be returned to. My name is Torben Elgaard Jensen. I'm a professor of science and technology studies, and I'm the leader of the Techno-Anthropology lab. I'm also one of the hosts of these seminar series. The two other hosts are Mathieu Jacomy. You can only see his image, but he's here operating the recording and many other things. The third host is Matt Artz, who is in Philadelphia, where he works as an AI product manager. Matt is one of our great American friends, and is also a mover and a shaker of the American field of applied anthropology. So why are we doing this seminar series? Why are we revisiting a couple of handfuls of old papers, or not so old papers? The key to this is that we're interested in revisiting various discussions and themes. We discuss these papers because they raise interesting issues in striking ways, but they don't settle the issues once and for all. The issues are recurrent features of our discussions in the Techno-Anthropology lab and our other professional conversations. We have made this paper series because we want to bring up these issues and have an opportunity to dig deep into them and discuss them in a good forum. So the paper today is a good example of a paper that brings up an interesting issue. It explores how to tell anthropological stories about a particular place called Kangerlussuaq in West Greenland, about its changing geological landscape, about its people, and about its animals. The paper is not just about this peculiar place, and quite a magnificent place, I can add. I've been there a couple of times, but it's also an exploration of what it means to tell stories or pluriversal stories. In that way, the paper, like all the previous ones in this paper series, includes some kind of experimental practice, in this case, an experiment in how to tell stories. And in a broader sense, it's also an experiment in how perhaps techno-anthropology can contribute to environmental humanities and discussions about the Anthropocene. We begin each of these seminars with an author interview. So Matt will interview Astrid Oberborbeck Andersen, who is the author of today's paper, and who is also an associate professor at the Techno-Anthropology lab. Matt will try to tease out how Astrid thinks about her fieldwork and the pluriversal stories and what the implications are of this approach. After the interview session, we invite all of you to join the discussion. Before handing over to Matt and to Astrid, let me just formally introduce today's paper. The paper is a chapter from a book published in 2023 called Storing Multipolar Climes of the Himalaya, Andes, and Arctic. The book was published on Routledge and was edited by Dan Smyer-Yee and Jelle Wouters. The title of Astrid's chapter in that book is Pluriversal Tundra, Storing More Than Human Ecologies Across Deep, Accelerated, and Troubled Times. So again, welcome everybody, and without further ado, I will hand over to you, Matt and Astrid.
Thanks, Torben. So, all right. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining. I should look forward to chatting with you today. I think the first thing I wanted to say, is just a general thanks for writing about the topic, right? It's obviously an important topic that we're all discussing and contributing to. It's not one that I directly study, but because I work in tech, it's become increasingly relevant to us, right? And the bigger topic of climate. as well as it's very relevant in all our lives. So it was a good read, really enjoyed it. And I want to get into it by, as we often do, setting the stage. And could you just tell us a little bit about, what led you to this type of field work? How did you get interested in the topic? Tell us about, how it all just came to be, the sort of genealogy of it.
Thank you, Matt, and also thank you, Torben, for the introduction. Yeah, good questions. So the research or the ethnographic research behind this paper was like part of a project about muskox human relations in Greenland across time. So it was a collaborative research project from 2019 to 23, where we were several anthropologists and archaeologists looking at how humans have shaped muskoxen livelihoods and habitats, and how muskoxen have shaped human societal habitats and livelihoods from like the entrance of muskoxen and humans into Greenland back like 4,500 years, and then throughout history and until today. And so we were located in different parts of Greenland, and of course also in different historical periods, you might say. And my research was in Kangerlussuaq, where the muskoxen were introduced. So that's one framing. And for this project, I did a lot of field work, ethnographic, but also collaborating with archaeologist Jens Fogh Jensen. So it was like visiting Kangerlussuaq and traveling the area with people who travel the landscape, both during winter, summer, spring, autumn, at different times of year, and thus meeting the many different people who both those who live here and use the landscape for hunting, but also those who come through as scientists. So there's a lot of, as is also written in the paper, there's a lot of like science infrastructure set up and science support, because this is the Greenland ice cap. And I say this because I'm actually currently in Kangerlussuaq. So it's just 30 kilometers from the ice cap, and with a big airport and landing strip, it's very easy to access the ice cap, but also the landscape leading up. So there's a lot of climate science, glaciology, geology, hydrology of all kinds that use this landscape and the place to access it. So as an anthropologist, my main method is actually like staying, hanging out, as we colloquially say, of course, doing more sort of formal interviews, walking the landscape, traveling it, and having conversations and getting to know from the different positions that are here. Observing, participating, and so forth. We've also done a little bit of drone photographing, but that's not really part of this paper.
Great. Thanks. So appreciate the context there. Now, with a little bit more context setting, so right up in the title, and then of course throughout the paper, you focus on three temporalities: the sort of deep time, the accelerated time, and the trouble time.
Mm-hmm.
Mind just unpacking that a little bit for us and why you use that as sort of your framing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I also write in the paper, the geology and the multiple temporalities are very accessible or very sort of observable in this landscape. So as it's the Arctic, there are no high trees, so there's not a big like vegetation that covers the geology, right? So the geology itself, the deep time is very pronounced. You can see on rocks how the ice has been like scratching across in different glacial periods. And then at the same time, it's the place as such, Kangerlussuaq, was established as a US air base. So that has its own particular temporal sort of output or footprint with a particular aesthetics and functionality. And then, of course, you have the sort of Danish colonial relations also on top of them, and the Greenlandic part. Currently it's an airport, it's a settlement, it's a Greenlandic settlement of some, I don't know, 400 people. So there's a school, there's a clinic, there's everything, there's a store, there's everything that a settlement has. And it's also a place where science sort of operates and where the Danish defense is increasingly also operating. So it is really, you have many different entities, interests, and presences, which are both sort of politically and materially here, and they have their different temporalities. And you're just walking around in this materiality. So just by observing and being present, the temporalities sort of impose their presence on you. And that's why, so this particular paper is a part, as Torben mentioned, of a book. So it started as a conference some years back, where I was invited to be a keynote. And obviously the sort of the premise or the intention of the book is to bring environmental humanities scholars from different regions together to make an intervention about climate change, or to write about climate change in the Himalaya, in the Andes, and in the Arctic, considering these very different locations as poles, as a kind of polar regions, of course, the Andes and Himalaya because of their altitude. And so the proposal was to think with this concept of climb, which is a concept that sort of attends to climatic changes, but from a like vernacular, you might say, perspective. So not climate change as this thing we know from the COP, from IPCC, but rather from how it's experienced, how it's related to, work through politically, practically in everyday lives on a local level. So the question was, how did I end with these three temporalities? I think I was working with muskoxen, and I've worked with climate in different settings, and since my PhD, and climate change always becomes something else when talking to people. It becomes environmental issues, it becomes too much water, strange, like altering the seasons, troubled transportation. And at the same time, obviously, being here in Garmslusswak, where so much of the sort of global climate change science is taking place, I had to somehow handle all of these layers in the same story. Or I thought that would be an interesting thing to do. How can we take this area, this site and its landscape, and try to work through the different versions or realities or worlds that exist in the same place put together. And temporality was a way to approach both the glacial and the sort of the new entrepreneurial interests, and also like the traditional kind of hunting that is, of course, also being reworked. But yeah, all of these in the same picture or story.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and so you bring up a number of things there that help paint the picture of the pluriversal framing, and definitely going to come back to that in just a second. Especially like these stories and ways of knowing and doing and living kind of converging. But before I want to go there, let me also ask about one other sort of framing decision you made for the paper, which was around the concept of storying, right? And so rather than describing or analyzing or some other descriptive that you could have used, you're framing it through this lens of storying. So, why that? What does that do for you in this paper?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Matt. And I'm gonna start responding the cheesy way by saying that it was imposed on me by the title and the whole framework of the book and the conversations prior to that. Because as you see, the book where this chapter is part is called Storying Multipolar Climes. So it comes with this sort of, it was the intention of the editors to like bring the strength of, it was probably an implicit claim that storying is what environmental humanities can do as a sort of intervention into the sciences, right? So it's both a contrast, but maybe also highlighting this as our strength to be able to story the world. Also, of course, a claim in that, well, what we present, it is stories rather than sort of hard facts and like outlining facts. And I think for me, it was a good challenge to work with. I found inspiration in Deborah Bird Rose and others who work with storying as a sort of device for crafting arguments, but also for bringing separate worlds into text and into scholarly conversations. And in this case, where the challenge was to sort of story across radically different temporalities and ontologies, I found it quite an interesting challenge, because who is the narrating voice? If you to make one story across these like big different scales, you might say. So I think this is actually a really interesting conversation that I'd like to have with everyone in the room, whether that is accomplished. An early reader of the paper also asked, well, what is this? Like, you try to decenter the human, yet like the human voice is so central in this. And like there are all of these kind of dilemmas that occur when we start both like storying and sort of invoking more than human or multi-species or decentered humanity and so forth.
Great, thank you. And in there you mentioned storying and ontology, so maybe we can get into that kind of convergence. So geologists, local Inuit, the entrepreneur story, which has that great quote about selling the water from the beginning of time, that really speaks to sort of that intention there. But obviously those are also in many ways in conflict. So let's maybe unpack those worldviews a bit, and then we'll sort of maybe dig into one or more of them individually. Could you just share with us sort of the perspectives of at least those three groups?
Yeah. Yeah, so the geologists that I describe and story with in this paper are are a group of Danish elderly geologists who have actually walked this landscape for decades and done like human observations, right? So they do old school analog field science, which in a way is quite in contrast to maybe the another kind of science which is also present in that collective or in that perspective, which is all the science which is done by sensors and satellites and which happens like off the ground. So one perspective is the scientific view, and the view of this landscape as a geological landscape that is shaped over millions of years and is continuously shaping and in accelerating ways. So in that sort of, and with the story of climate change, it also holds several of these temporalities, right? Both the deep time, but also the accelerated and the trouble time through that perspective. The second perspective is of like entrepreneurs who also work their way through making these climate change into a profit. So it's actually just one who got a concession for extracting water from the ice cap. So what that company does, it's a very small one person, more or less, company that like taps water from the ice sheet as it melts and then transports it to Denmark to distill gin and vodka, and even he was trying with like brewing beer, which, as the title says, tastes like the beginning of time, or and so that's another perspective, right? So representing ways in which actually also just turning the landscape and the things that it offers, including the changes, into livelihoods and modes of living and new incomes. And then the Inuit population, who the oldest type of hunting that happens in this landscape is the summer hunt for caribou and now also musk oxen. And traditional, it's carried out and still by people like families living on the coast and traveling in through the fjord and then settling in the area and camps for several weeks to hunt caribou and muskox and dry the meat and get fresh meat and then bring it back home and spend the summer and summer holiday as a family, teaching, like being together as a family in completely different ways than in their everyday life, and going back. And so these are three quite different perspectives or like worlds that come together and sometimes clash in this landscape.
Thanks. And, of those kind of converging realities, there is there's sort of sense that when you write about the Inuit, right, there is a worldview that may be very different than potentially, some who would be accustomed to terms, some of the more scientific terms, and a worldview of potentially seeing, the external and even the internal sort of relating. Celia, if I say that right, is the term I'm thinking of there. But would you maybe help us start to see why they view this sort of interconnected ecosystem in a way that is maybe different than some of the sort of scientific terms that we might use to view these, and how that sort of helps or how that creates maybe some of the tension between these worldviews?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a great question, and I think I don't think you can like quantify the relationality in that sense, and so meaning that I don't think necessarily that the geologists see the world as less relational than the Inuit, but in this particular, the relations and the scales across which these relations travel, or the entities that are relationally connected, are radically different. And so in practice, the geologists and the Inuit hunters who use the landscape don't like directly clash, and there's no direct conflict between them, right? I think many people, when they travel the land, see science infrastructure like measuring devices, and they have no clue what that is. So people traveling the land, like Inuit traveling the land hunting, do like see these science infrastructures and have no idea what's being measured, and that's a nuisance. But I think these particular worldviews are not necessarily clashing, but they exist, and they understand relations and cause effect in very different ways.
Thanks. And so, when speaking of the Inuit worldview, you sort of spoke of like the almost like somebody framed it as like the earth is potentially responding, right, to the conditions, to the sort of human actions in this way. And that gives sort of a sentence to to the earth in some sense. So can you kind of unpack that and think about how we might be thinking about this in a more than human way?
Yeah, so it's so to unpack it, there in the I call the section like storying with Sila, and Sila is the Greenlandic and Pan-Inuit word for weather, for universe, for mind, for simply outside, like outside of a house. So it's a concept, it's one of several concepts that also that has like so many layered meanings, and that people use every day to both sometimes simply describe what is happening. So Sila Ayokbok, like Sila, is the weather is bad, causing a lot of like having an impact on how you can travel, what you can do, what you cannot do. But it can also mean Sila Ayokbok, the same words can mean like I'm in a bad state of my head as a simply like descriptive thing. And so it's a very sort of expansive concept or presence that orders, you can say, like the world and relations in a completely different way than, say, earth science does. And there's an agency in that and in how the weather impacts daily doings in the Arctic that is completely different from, let's say, yeah, how I'm impacted by weather in my daily doings in Aarhus and Aalborg, right? And Sila is one of those big concepts, and there are other concepts like that in Greenlandic and other Inuit languages. So it's difficult to unpack it fully, but there's a lot of like thinking with Marisol de la Cadena, an anthropologist in whom I find really a lot of inspiration in thinking of how these presences and agencies exist in many ways simultaneously. Sila, or weather, is both weather as we know it, but it's also not only weather as we know it. So there's some kind of excess that exists between these indigenous ontologies and what we can, like in a simplified way, say Western ontologies. So things that just can't be translated, and an excess that cannot necessarily be known. And of course, the science in my paper represents this aim to know everything, that is going on and happening with our climate. While as if I try to, you could say that in a Sila ontology, there's an acceptance also that you cannot know, and that Sila has its own agency that you cannot control or know, but you have to sort of adapt to and live with and work with.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Now, seeing as you just mentioned agency there, and maybe coming back to that more than human framing.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously, your work points right in a direction that helps us try to see why we need to view the world that way, or what we could potentially benefit from in seeing it that way by bringing together these different worldviews. It also makes me think of like multi-species ethnography and kind of multi-temporal and multi-scalar and sort of these different lenses for thinking about the world. And so related to all of that, you have a quote that jumped out at me for a particular reason because it relates to some things that I've worked on, but it was not all becoming is co-becoming. And I would love to hear more about that particular framing, and why you believe that, what is your worldview around that?
So I think that's a kind of that's probably the more like political ecology inspiration, and also of the same like post-colonial thinkers within anthropology and the ontological turn, like Mario Blaser and Marisol de la Cadena. But so the power relations and the unequal power relations there, right? So if we do accept that everything is in a state of change and becoming, and not the world is still being made and unfinished, and that we have to make room for more sort of co-becoming or becoming with, as Donna Haraway phrases it, then we also have to be aware that not everyone is positioned with equal power in those relations of becoming. So, and that's, I think, an important point of this paper, that that when we try to explain and measure and govern everything based on like Western science, many presences and existences are silenced or erased. And the papers is actually sort of a call to try to open up the possibility of what exists and make a place for those what ifs, in a way, like in our way of thinking and governing and understanding the world and its changes. And so not all becoming is co-becoming, is, well, the current state that not everything is seen or even acknowledged as a co in that becoming. So it points to the erasure that also continuously happens, and that often becomes apparent when you work in a post-colonial or colonial or formerly colonized and place, where those erasures are also articulated and critiqued and like continuously by in this case Greenlandic people and of different identities.
Yeah, thank you for unpacking that. I think it also helps, illuminate the value of this pluriversal sort of perspective that you bring. But that does raise one last question for me, and then after that, we should probably open it up. Which is, so, you help us, through the stories, see these different ways of knowing, of understanding the world, and how they relate to something like climate change. But for me, then the question from an like applied sense is, how do we wrestle with all of these, right, in a modern kind of governance context where, we do need to get parties to the table to hear the different perspectives, to help each other see and hear one another. But any thoughts on, like, where we go from an applied perspective? How do we put this into practice so that we can create change?
I think so. What I highlight is pluriversal TUNDRA, or the pluriverse, as like both a descriptive concept, and in this paper it's probably more a descriptive practice than a prescriptive, right? So in concrete terms, my next steps in my sort of research journey is to try to work across disciplines. So currently I'm starting a project with biologists, with local hunters, with local governance, and hopefully also like the Greenlandic management parts, where we will try to bring these different ways of knowing, and in this case muskoxen, together. And so like where we in practice and through a project can ask the questions, the concerns we have, try to describe for one another what are the issues at stake, generate the knowledge that generate the methodology for creating the knowledge, and then maybe making suggestions for policy. And this is of course more particular for the case of like a particular animal, muskoxen, and then bringing these to policy. So I think that's a way to like work across disciplines and actors and in collaborations, and try to think, how do we move forward with this? And of course, like my particular task here then is to say to the biologists that are collaborating to introduce the concept of pluriverse and see, well, what do they, yeah. And also hunters and other local stakeholders, like, is this a concept that works for them, or should we think in a different way and have negotiations around that?
Well, thank you for that, and thanks for the paper and sharing all that you did. We probably should open it up. So does anybody want to jump in with any questions?
I could ask a question. Oh, Asha was first. Asha, please go ahead.
Sorry, some technological difficulties. Yeah, I was still trying to formulate the question in a decent way in my head before asking it, but anyway, I raised my hand, so I'll go. Astrid, a very interesting paper, and you talked a lot about the question of agency, and then who is the narrating voice within this storying device and all of that. And I was just curious to see how that affects the actual practice of writing such a paper where you're dealing with academic text as stories. And then, one thing is to work across these flatter ontologies and non-anthropocentric views when you're doing the field work or doing the research, but one thing is also writing it, which is a very human-centric act anyway. So yeah, I was just interested to hear your thoughts about that and how that affects your writing.
That's a great question, and I think we could have long conversations about that. And I struggled a lot because the paper opens with a kind of description of the geological temporality, right? The landscape as a whole, and the forces that have shape it in that sort of in the deep time. And then this third story, which is Inuit, the like Sila story, is mainly centered about around a father and his daughter who want to go hunting, and those are actually fictionalized characters that are not unlikely to be real. And of course, and so I'm not a geologist and I'm not an Inuit, and there's so many things that I am not, but so it was a big challenge to like write those worlds out across the differences. And I had a lot of like thoughts about should I of course, like the quotes. So there are 3 Inuit who figure in the story, and the father-daughter are like, well, a condensation of people that I've seen, but they turn out to be fictitious. And the third is a real person. And the geologists are real persons too, and the entrepreneur is real too. So there's one like layer of the story that is told through characters, right? And human interactions that tell about their relation to the landscape and understanding and way of working in it. And then there's another layer which tries to give like the overview and be more descriptive. And those are, of course, that's also a storying with different ways of zooming and different like grasping elements. And yeah, that's difficult. And if I were to write it today, I would probably write it in a different way. I don't know if it responded to the question.
Oh, it did. Thank you. Yes, I know we can talk about this at length. Maybe we should at some other time, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, and one person reading it early on said actually, well, this is a very human-centered story. So like, yeah, it's difficult. Yeah. I don't know who was first, Torben or Laura, actually, right? Or Torben? No, Torben. No, yeah, I don't know. Matt,
Okay,
do the.
ladies first.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Astrid. This was a super nice read. I really enjoyed it. I think like while I was reading, so my way of reading it was, of course, I was trying to also use concepts that you introduce here for my own work, right? This is often what happens, that you're like, okay, how could I use that? And then, while I was sort of reading your descriptions, there were certain times where I thought, hey, I mean, this, like the way you describe this, we could say that about a lot of places. Like, for example, right in the beginning, you write, this landscape is formed and deformed by geological and climatic forces over millions of years, and and it's undergoing so I was a little bit like, I would be interested in hearing a little bit about the how, like, is it a special place? Is it something that we can't do elsewhere? Is it, I think you said a bit in the beginning of your introductions, or your first answer to Matt, it's just a place where we can really see this, there's no trees here, so we can, it's a good place to observe, it's a good site. So maybe you can say a little bit about that. And I have a second question that is related. That is that during your explanations now as well, it seems very much, it's a very strong bifurcation between the scientific world that tries to control and tries to know and tries to, is related sort of to progress and growth and, all of those things. And on the other hand, it's the sila ontology, as you say, that, waits and is patient and doesn't mean to control, but sort of, and I see that also in Arturo Escobar's writing a lot on the pluriverse design, that it's sort of, it's this idea that we can localize the pluriverse in the indigenous, and and then there's the other way, like the patriarchy way, the hegemonial way. And I would be interested in, like, are there ambiguities in this? Like, I mean, I could imagine that, there's a lot of science in being, having a sila ontology, and there may be a lot of, waiting around, or, sensing the weather in the scientific ontology. So I'm a bit like, I would like to hear a bit more about the, the purity maybe of these two.
Yeah, now that's a great comment, and that's something that I struggled with also when writing it, because it does become sort of slightly purified, and in ways that both exist as such, but not only. I think my choice when it came to, like, finally I chose these as because there's still like a power hierarchy of that needs to be addressed between the dominantly Western way of producing truths about this landscape, and then also that result into how the landscape is governed, and how hunting and movement in the landscape is governed. And I think that still needs to be like addressed, broken down, changed to different ways. And it's funny because and of course, like, if I were to follow the scientists around, there would be a lot of waiting, and of course Sila also intervenes in their daily their field work here, right? And so another paper could definitely look more into how these hunters who go into the landscape, what they do when they're not hunting. And there's a lot of entrepreneurial stuff, and it's not like they live in their pure sila ontology all day and all night, because they also do look at, like, the air, the weather forecast, and use computers, and have built their own businesses for. It could be the same hunter who taps water at the ice, and then in his spare time, in his vacation, goes out. So of course, there's also a lot of movement between those worlds, and that's maybe also where the co-becoming exists. And that's where I would say, like, pluriverse as a prefigurative concept, there's a lot of work to be done there, as with the, like, design part. How do we make these worlds speak together and bring them in conversation when building policy and coexistence and other things. But yeah, great questions. I don't think that was only the bifurcation part. Oh yeah, the other one was, could this apply for anywhere? And I guess in a way, I mean, you could turn it into a methodology that could be used in many places. But there is a particularity about the Arctic and Greenland being like a climate science hotspot. And there are particular modes of hunting and relations that happen here. But of course, like pluriversal relations and silencing, erasure of the voices and existences happen everywhere. Great questions.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for this paper, Astrid. I think it was a really fascinating read and also yeah, in many ways different, very different from the other papers we've been reading in this series. So I think the question that I want to ask you is about is inspired by at some point when reading this, I sort of felt like almost like reverse engineering and thinking about, how did you put the parts of this text together? And one observation that I had was that you tell these stories, and then there's obviously when you write a text, something very important in deciding the sequence of these stories. When people write papers using mixed methods, for instance, it's always the method they insert at the end is the one they trust the most because that will have the final word. And in the same sense, in your paper here, you have the geologist, you have the entrepreneur, and then you have the Inuit at the end, which I think, even though you position them as sort of on par, equal in a certain way, then the way the text works somehow gives the Inuit the final words. I'm not sure you agree with that, but I just want to put that to you. And another thing I wondered about is you must have wondered a lot about what to write in the conclusion. You have these stories, but what to make of it, how to fit them together. And I think you say various things like you can connect through these stories, you can understand and so on, and then you end on a sentence which is about that where you're saying that it's about making space for epistemological and ontological multiplicity. So at the end of the day, it's about making space, and then I'm thinking about, so is this somehow positioning itself against sort of more singular discourses that make less space, or is this essentially sort of an opening space making move? Is that the important part of it, or you somehow you must have thinking about where did you want to land this story? What did you want the final sentence to be? And you picked this one. So I wonder if you could tell us more about your what happened in the writer's brain or considerations when you wrote this.
Yeah, another great question, Torben. And I have to admit flat down, I think conclusions are the hardest to write of all in a text. And so you got me there on my weak spot. But I think it connects to the analytical and world-making endeavor, right? If the argument is an opening argument and opening space, then how can you conclude? And so the final word is a difficult one to author and take on, yet we have to do so. And I think I think that the question about the sequencing of the story is a really good one. And I think I started with the geology because it was a nice arrival of the reader into this landscape. Of course, we could also have started with going hunting, and the paper would have had a different sequence, like starting from down and then going up and flying over the landscape. So I think that's a nice thing to think with. I'm not sure if I intentionally gave the Inuit the final word, but probably yes, so because that's where the necessity, the contrast is biggest in a way, and there's a necessity for the argument for the pluriverse and so forth. But yeah, good spot, well spotted. I think when I was thinking about this just before this session, I thought that like there's one claim in the paper of like, or intention of making space or insisting on a place for like our kinds of sciences. So both environmental humanities, STS, and the linked in climate science and in how we, as a big and compassive and complex we, how we understand climate change and climatic changes and how they impact locally and globally. So that's one thing. And the other one is then making a case for silenced voices, or making a place also for silenced voices and existences in those narratives, but also in policy. And whether or not I accomplished to make that clear in the conclusion, yeah, I don't know, but let that be the conclusion now.
I feel your pain writing conclusions. It's a mess.
Yeah.
David?
Hey, wonderful paper. I was just wondering how or if there was some types of temporality that got left on the cutting room floor. So were there observations and parts that you wrote that so how did you decide basically on these three and only these three time aspects of deep and accelerated and multiple? And then the co-occurrence I understand, but when do you know when to stop, I guess, is kind of the question. Also a similar writing question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are definitely many temporalities that were left out, and I don't have a sort of current map of them. But so those three are kind of the organizing. They work well as titles, but in the text, I actually also do some work of like undoing them. So saying that they exist, that both like the geology understanding and practices hold all, the Sila temporality holds all, the entrepreneurial time holds all of them. So I try to make them even break down the like purity of these three. And of course, there's a lot of more than human temporality that is in the landscape. So the relations between the animals and the vegetation and the geomorphology and the ice. And so it's actually more sort of also a multiplying of temporalities, that rather where the three deep, accelerated, and troubled are just like more or less random, not completely random, of course, but selected to like hold the text and what is in it, but not an attempt to like describe or fully grasp this is this thing, this is the other, and this is the third.
All right, we are nearing the end, but if someone have a final burning question, there is still time.
We weren't doing conclusions anymore.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I like your comments in the chat, Laura, that we should leave conclusions to ChatGPT. Yes. Okay. On that note, I will not conclude, but I will end this session. But thank you very much, Astrid, for writing this paper and for discussing it with us. And thanks to everybody for participating. I think it was a really fascinating journey and the really fascinating conversations about how to narrate and the terms of that and what are we doing when we do that and how can we do that. On a personal note, I want to say that I was at a seminar yesterday where the debate was on whether artificial intelligence would gain agency, and the premise of all that discussion was an utterly simplified idea about what agency is. They should have read your paper. So thanks for bringing these conversations out, and thanks to everybody for participating. On a final note, we're back next Wednesday with yet another episode of this. It will be about mapping algorithms, and it will be Anders Munk, who is our guest at that session. So thank you for now. Have a good day.